Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. Today, we are going to be talking all about dancer first aid, or what to do if we or one of our dancers gets injured during the dance season. First of all, just a small disclaimer, the information in this podcast is not meant to replace proper medical assessment and medical information, and it also does not pertain to emergency type situations. So if we have an injury that happens that is more of an emergency situation, so we have a dancer who has anything that involves like a head injury, any loss of consciousness, like open wounds, suspected broken bones, things like that, we are always going to seek out emergency medical care. So this information in terms of sort of dancer first aid is very much more applicable to musculoskeletal type injuries, which are the most common types of injuries that we see in dancers. So I just want to get that little disclaimer out of the way just to make sure that we're all on the same page and talking about the same thing. So I'm sure a lot of you, especially if you are a dance teacher, have taken some basic first aid courses throughout the years. And a lot of people, even if you haven't taken a first aid course, are familiar with some of these first aid kind of acronyms that were often what we would do if we had an injury and how we would kind of treat an injury. And the most common one that most people are aware of is this principle of RICE. And so that's an acronym that stands for rest, ice, compression, and elevation. And there's been various iterations of that over the years. In fact, I think the very first time I ever took a first aid course, like when I was in high school, I actually think the acronym was just ICE, like ICE, so that ice, compression, elevation. They added the R to it, and then there's often, there's sort of more recent acronyms where they've added a P to it as well, so it was the protect, rest, ice, compress, elevate. Anyway, any of those iterations have been around for a really long time and are commonly taught within first aid settings. And as far as I am aware, are still the most common kind of first aid principles that are taught in most standard first aid courses. But within the sort of field of, especially physiotherapy, but kind of sports medicine and hopefully now permeating into the world of dance medicine as well, there's been a new acronym that's been proposed. This was a few years ago. I think it was first kind of published in, I believe it was the British Journal of Sports Medicine, so BJSM. And it is a new acronym that really is probably much more evidence-based in terms of what we actually want to do if we have a dancer who has sustained an injury, and hopefully will become the new norm moving forwards in terms of how we deal with injuries and kind of like these more basic sort of first aid principles. So some of you might have heard of this acronym before. Some of you, this is going to be completely new, but the new acronym that we are trying to promote and really try and utilize within sports injuries or dance injuries is peace and love, and peace spelled like PEACE. So peace and love is the new acronym. And I'm going to break this down for you and talk a little bit about the different elements of it. The thing I really like about this new acronym is it really accounts for the acute stage of an injury and then moving into the subacute or the more rehabilitation part of an injury as well. So with that peace and love acronym, the peace part of it is really what we want to take into account in the acute phase of an injury. So when an injury just first happens, what is it we're going to do? And that's what the old kind of RICE or ICE principle used to kind of be addressing, was really that acute phase. So somebody rolls their ankle in class and we'd immediately run and grab an ice pack and put it on the ice pack, or put the ice pack on the injury. And that was kind of our old first aid principles. So the peace part of the acronym is going to account for our acute injuries. And then the LOVE part of the acronym is going to be our more subacute or moving into the more rehab phase of an injury. And the thing I also really like about the kind of LOVE part of this acronym is it can be applied to like not acute type injury, so more chronic overuse injuries. And we see so many of those in the dance world. The majority of injuries that we see fall into that kind of more chronic or overuse category. And so we might not need the PEACE part of the acronym for those injuries, but the LOVE part of the acronym absolutely 100% applies. So I'm going to break down both PEACE and LOVE and kind of walk you through what each of the letters within that stands for and the types of things we want to be doing. So we'll start with PEACE, and just very quickly, and I will kind of get into all of these a little bit more in detail, but the P stands for protection, E is for elevation, A is for avoiding anti-inflammatories, C is compression, and then the E is education, although I actually like to kind of switch that around a little bit, and I'll tell you about that in a second. So if we go back to the beginning of that PEACE and LOVE, we sometimes would see this P in the old Rice principle, and people would kind of call it Price as well, but it is protection. So when we have an acute injury that just happens, we want to protect that injured area. And so the easiest or most common way that we protect that injured area immediately is often by unloading that area. So again, if we have sort of an example of, say, an ankle sprain, and maybe I'll just use an ankle sprain injury throughout all of this because it's a really easy sort of thing for a lot of people to visualize. A lot of people have rolled their ankle before. They kind of can relate to that. If we're thinking about the protection phase of that, and kind of like unloading it or protecting that, oftentimes we're going to end up like not bearing weight on that. So that might look like, depending on the severity of the injury, it might look like using crutches. It might just look like, stopping dancing for a few minutes or that day or a few days to unload and protect that area and prevent any further damage from happening in that area. So we might be looking at restricting specific movements. So maybe we don't want to move the ankle in one certain direction, but we can move it in other directions, things like that. But a lot of the times we're going to be looking at unloading an area, so taking weight or taking pressure off of that area. So our P is for protecting that area. Elevation, pretty self-explanatory and existed within the old acronym as well. We want to elevate that area above the level of the heart if there is sort of swelling and inflammation that is happening with respect to this injury and the healing of this injury. And so, depending on the body part, sometimes elevating things is easier said than done in certain areas, but the principle is just that we want that area elevated above the level of the heart in order to sort of facilitate circulation and make sure that we don't have swelling and stuff pooling in that area. So our E stands for elevation. Next, we have A, and this is potentially maybe like the most controversial part of this new acronym, although when we actually look at the research and look at the evidence, it really should not be controversial. But the A stands for avoiding anti-inflammatories. And I think in practice and in reality, a lot of people are still taking anti-inflammatory medications when they first have an injury. And there's this idea of like, okay, we are going to pump you full of anti-inflammatories. And this is like doctors are still prescribing a lot of anti-inflammatories in these situations as well. Like this isn't just people doing this willy-nilly. Like this is still very, very commonly prescribed. However, we actually know from research that the use of anti-inflammatories in the early stages of healing actually disrupts and delays the healing process. And this is a fairly complicated sort of physiological process, and I'm not going to get into like all of the details of it, but the inflammatory process exists for a reason. So if we injure ourselves, and it doesn't matter what the injury is, it can even just be like a paper cut or anything like that. But if we're going to use that example of an ankle sprain, so say we sprain our ankles, we've damaged one of the ligaments in our ankle, the body starts this cascade of events that happens physiologically that we term the inflammatory process. as a way of starting the healing process. So the inflammation that happens in that area actually serves a purpose to bring healing cells into that area to start the healing process and the repair process of the tissue that has been damaged. And there are instances where this inflammatory process gets kind of out of control, and that is often why anti-inflammatories might be brought in to be like, okay, we want to control this, or this process is going on for longer than we want it to go on, or things like that. But we actually need that inflammatory process to happen to kickstart healing and to kind of signal to the body that this is an area that needs to be repaired in through there. And so we know from research now that if we're using anti-inflammatories, we can actually be disrupting that process and potentially kind of delaying that healing process from happening. So we really want to try to avoid the use of anti-inflammatories in this acute phase of injury healing. It is perfectly acceptable and may be necessary to use some sort of pain control medication, depending on the injury and the severity of pain associated with it. But we want that to be a non-anti-inflammatory type of pain control. So some common names, because a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of the difference of what is an anti-inflammatory versus what is not. The two most common brand name medications that we see, at least in Canada, and I know there's slightly different names, different places in the world, but we would have like our Tylenol versus our Advil. So Tylenol, the medical ingredient in that is acetaminophen, or in some places in the world it's called paracetamol, and it is just an analgesic. So it is just a painkiller or like a pain reliever. So those types of medications would be appropriate if you need something to help control pain after an injury. The other classification would be like what we would commonly call Advil, or ibuprofen is the kind of medical ingredient in it that most people are familiar with that terminology. So medications that are ibuprofen based or naproxen based or things like that, those are anti-inflammatories. And those are the ones that we actually want to avoid in the early stages so that we can actually allow that inflammatory process to happen to kickstart that healing process. Now, like I said, there are instances where anti-inflammatories may absolutely be appropriate, kind of on a case-by-case basis, but generally, and like for the types of injuries that we're seeing in dancers and in kind of in studio settings or happening in like competitions or things like that, oftentimes we don't need those anti-inflammatories on board, and we probably don't want them, at least at the beginning. And so we want to try and choose pain control medications that are more just analgesic based and not anti-inflammatory based. So I realize that this is a little bit controversial, and there's a lot of people who are going to come out and say, but my doctor said this, and, you know, like have been told otherwise. And this is definitely something that is changing fairly quickly within the medical field. And it really is sort of more recent research that we are understanding more about what's actually happening at a physiological level. And so there are people who are still maybe a little bit more, I don't know, we'll call them old school maybe. So this might not be the exact information that you're hearing, but if you are interested in like learning more, you can absolutely like Google some of this information, and there is lots of research to support that we don't want to be using anti-inflammatories in the like acute phase of healing in these types of musculoskeletal injuries. So that is our A in peace and love. Then our C is compression. And again, this is not any different than our old acronym that was the like rice or price. So it had that compression, that C in it as well. And that compression can look like different things. So sometimes that looks like using like tensor bandages in the area. It might be using like, say, a compression sock or a compression sleeve. It might be using tape, especially some of the more elastic based tapes like K-tape and things like that can have a compressive element to them. So the compression can look like different things, but providing compression in the area to prevent like large amounts of pooling and edema and things like that can be helpful. So that is our C. And then the E in peace in the official acronym stands for education, but the original article that was written in BJSM was directed at clinicians. And so that education piece was like the clinicians educating, you know, their client or their patient on the injury and how to like, you know, best go about rehabilitating it and that type of thing. And so I actually, when I'm teaching the peace and love principle or like giving this information directly to dance teachers or to dancers or to parents, I often change that E to evaluate. So generally, depending again on like the severity and what the injury is, but for the most part, generally, we want to go get that injury evaluated by somebody. And it depends again a bit on the severity of the injury, whether that evaluation means going to the hospital to like get sort of emergency imaging. Like if we suspect a fracture or something like that, we might need x-rays, or maybe that evaluation is going to the family doctor, or maybe that evaluation is going directly to like a physio or a chiro or a more rehabilitation-based like healthcare professional. So that evaluate, or the E, like I said, it can stand for education, and that's kind of officially what it stands for, but I like to think of it much more as evaluate. We want to evaluate this injury and see, you know, the severity of the injury, what is the diagnosis of the injury, that type of thing. So that is our peace and love protocol, and that is, like I said, the acute phase of an injury. You will notice that the new peace and love protocol leaves out that I, which always stood for ICE prior. And again, this is like a little bit controversial, but it's for the exact same reason that that A stands for avoiding anti-inflammatories. So that idea of icing an injury immediately was always predicated on, okay, we want to reduce the inflammation. We want to stop swelling. We want it to not swell up. Like we want to prevent that from happening. And again, if we think about that physiological process where we need that inflammatory process to kickstart the healing in that area, we potentially don't want to be stopping that from happening. So perhaps using ice is again kind of disrupting or delaying that process from happening. And so you will hear practitioners say like, we should never ever be icing an injury, like it's like completely counterproductive and whatever. And I'm a little bit more reasoned maybe, or I don't know what the right terminology is, but a little bit more cautious about like throwing that blanket statement out, because I think ice still absolutely has a time and a place in injury management, but perhaps for different reasons than what we think we're doing. And so again, maybe in that first few days of an acute injury, we don't necessarily want to be icing it because we don't want to disrupt that inflammatory process. But ice is also a really, really powerful analgesic. And so it often provides people a lot of pain relief. And so if we are using ice from that perspective, and that is what we're trying to accomplish with ice, I think we can still use it, but it doesn't need to be part of our immediate first aid protocol. And then I think we need to be maybe cautious in like the use of it or how we're using it. And so we want to make sure that if we're using it more for analgesic purposes, that we're doing shorter spurts. What we don't want is necessarily somebody like putting ice on an injury and leaving it on for say like an hour or something like that. We're going to say, okay, you can ice that injury, but it's going to be for 10 minutes and like maybe just like a few times a day or that type of thing. So again, it's not necessarily an either or. Like it doesn't have to be yes or no to ice. We just want to know why we're using it and in what setting we're using it for. So I certainly don't tell people, oh, you should never, ever, ever be icing anything, because I do think there's times where it can be appropriate, but we just need to use a little bit of reasoning about like, okay, why are we using it? What are we trying to accomplish from it? And when we're thinking about this kind of first aid for a really acute injury, that isn't going to be the first thing we're going to reach for in terms of like that ice. We're going to go to our PEACE protocol, which is the protect, elevate, avoid anti-inflammatories, compress, and then evaluate that injury. So that's our acute side of things, the PEACE part of our acronym. And then that love part of it is when we're moving into that sort of subacute phase. And so in terms of like timing of that, it really depends on what the injury is and the severity of the injury. So this, you might be moving more into this like love part of the first aid protocol within a couple of days. If it's a more mild injury, it might be more a couple of weeks if it's a more severe injury. And so that's where the evaluation really becomes important to know what you're dealing with injury-wise. But our LOVE protocol stands for load, optimism, vascularization, and exercise. And I will, of course, talk you through these as well. So the L being load, we know that for injuries to heal, and especially injuries that involved any sort of ligament, tendon, musculoskeletal tendon junction complex, any of those types of structures, we need to load them in order for them to be able to adapt and to heal. And so back in the old days, so this is, years and years and years ago, we used to put people on bed rest for like fairly simple injuries where people would be, prescribed bed rest for weeks at a time. And it was like, okay, just don't move, lie in bed for 3 weeks, and then you'll be magically cured and you'll, get up and walk around. And we now know that that was pretty poor advice, and we definitely did not see good outcomes, let's say, in terms of injury healing. And in fact, the complications from that in terms of loss of strength and all sorts of things were far, far more dangerous than kind of loading that tissue. And so we know for those tissues to be able to heal properly, they need to be loaded. And so loading is going to be part of this kind of rehabilitation process. We want to be fairly measured and quite controlled in the way we go about loading it. So if we have, again, our ankle sprain example, we're not going to go from, unloading that area, protecting that area, maybe using crutches for a few days, straight to being like, okay, just go back to running and jumping. You'll be totally fine. Obviously, we need to progressively load that area. So we're going to go from, potentially having that area unloaded to, a little bit of protected weight bearing or sort of protected loading, and then gradually increase that as the tissues heal. And so the loading, although, like I said, very, very, very important for tissues to be able to adapt and heal, has to be done in a pretty systematic and controlled manner. And this is why it's really important to work with a healthcare practitioner, and especially one who's used to working with active populations. So whether that is dance specific, which would be ideal, or potentially even more just sport populations, they'll still understand that principle of sort of loading and how we want to deal with those injuries. So our L stands for load. The O stands for optimism. And I don't love that word necessarily, but I understand why they put it in because it made the acronym work really well with peace and love. But really, it's just addressing and understanding that our mental capacity or our headspace plays a huge role in our body's ability to recover from an injury and how we are able to adapt and deal with that injury. And so I don't necessarily love that they've used the word optimism. That kind of makes it feel or sound like you should be happy and shiny and oh, the world will be great, it's totally fine. That's not necessarily the point, but I do think it's important to recognize that there is absolutely a kind of mind-body connection that happens, and we need to be able to address that. And so if somebody's really struggling with their injury, and we see this a lot in dancers, that if they're especially going to be out of dance for a period of time, or they're missing a competition or a performance or something they were really looking forward to, that can be really hard to deal with from a mental side of things. And so we can see people who, maybe develop amounts of depression or anxiety around the injury. When am I going to be able to get back to dancing? How quickly is this going to recover? And we want and need to be able to address that. So like I said, I don't love the word optimism because I think it sounds a little bit too pretty and shiny. But just recognizing that our mental wellness plays massively into our physical wellness, and we need to be addressing that at the same time, is really what they're getting at with that O in this acronym in through there. And so if you have had an injury, or you have a dancer who has had an injury and they are struggling with that kind of rehab side of things and maybe dealing with the injury, really making sure that they're getting the support that they need from that perspective, from a mental health perspective, will make a huge amount of difference, because sometimes that can be the biggest barrier to a dancer coming back, isn't the physical injury itself. Maybe the physical injury is actually healing quite well, but they're really, really anxious about returning back to the studio and having the same injury happen again, or it can be so many different things. So we just want to make sure that we are addressing that side of things in the subacute or rehab phase of an injury. Our V stands for vascularization. And so that is just a fancy way of saying blood flow, basically. And so we need blood flow going to the area that is injured. I mean, we want blood flow going through our whole body, but we need it especially going to the area that is injured. And so the easiest way to think about this is like cardiovascular exercise type things. And so we also want dancers to participate in cardiovascular exercise to maintain some of their cardiovascular fitness while they're injured, especially if they're not participating in like classes or things like that. But it's also really important for injury healing, just to be able to circulate things and get blood flowing to that area. And so depending on what the injury is, our options might look different. So again, if we have an ankle sprain, we're probably not going to have that dancer out jogging or doing a lot of like really high impact load bearing cardiovascular exercise, because that might be contraindicated with their injury. But they may be able to stationary cycle, for instance, where it's lower impact, or maybe they're swimming or doing something that's like really low impact. So we want to make sure that we're participating in some sort of cardiovascular activity or exercise to help get blood flow to that area. And that is in addition to the kind of loading that we're already doing from an exercise-based perspective. And then the E actually just stands for exercise. And so again, it kind of ties into that load. So the load is the idea of like, having like force go through the area that has been injured. But exercise is really making sure that we're then bringing people up to the level they need to be at again. So it's more of like kind of like maybe our end phase rehabilitation. So it's that progressive overloading principle and then adding exercise. And when we think of exercise, we're not just thinking of exercise for the area that is injured, although we're absolutely going to be looking at, in our ankle example, like the strength and the stability of the ankle itself. So making sure we have strong calf muscles and all of that. But we also want to be looking at exercise for the entire body. So making sure our core and our turnout and like just everything that is involved in being a dancer, that we haven't lost any conditioning in those areas while we're rehabilitating from an injury. So you can see that in this love protocol, it really is all about kind of more that rehab side of things and getting people back doing what it is we want them doing, and really kind of avoiding a lot of like unnecessary unloading or unnecessary kind of sedentary type things. So it's really, really important for injury healing to make sure that we're loading it appropriately while we're going through rehab, rather than just saying, okay, take 2 weeks off or take 6 weeks off and then you can go straight back to dance. And unfortunately, that is still advice we're seeing a lot within the medical system. So I get loads of dancers coming into the clinic who have maybe been to see their family doctor, and the family doctor's been like, well, maybe just take 2 weeks off and then you'll feel better and then you can just go straight back to dance, or take 6 weeks off, or whatever that advice is. And it's not just family doctors. This advice is coming from other people within the medical system as well. And really, we know that total healing isn't going to happen just by unloading an area. In order to get somebody back doing what it is they want to be doing or need to be doing from a dance perspective, we need to be loading the area. We need to be doing cardiovascular stuff to vascularize or get blood flow to the area. And then we need to be making sure that we're exercising to build up like that strength and endurance and power and whatever other characteristics the area of the body needs from where it was injured. So that is our new peace and love principle. Like I said, it's kind of a really handy first aid sort of acronym to have in the back of your mind. So if you get an injury or you have a dancer in one of your classes who has an injury, we want to think peace and love rather than RICE or PRICE or whatever old acronyms we had before. Like I said, I don't know that this is being like widely taught within first aid curriculums yet, but hopefully we will see that shift starting to happen as there's more and more research that supports this new peace and love acronym over the old acronyms, which didn't necessarily have a whole lot of evidence to support them. They were just commonly used within the first aid world. So I hope that's helpful for all of you guys, especially moving into competition season. We know that injuries are an unfortunate reality of the dance world, and we're never going to eliminate 100% of injuries. So it's really important that we know how to deal with it and what's going to help us get back to dancing the quickest if we do end up having an injury, so that hopefully we can get back to doing what we love as quickly as possible. if you have any questions, comments, want clarification on any of that, please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me on all social media platforms at Dance Physio Erika, or send me an email. My email address is in the show notes. And if you found this episode helpful, I would love it if you would share it with a friend, a colleague, anyone else who is working with dancers, especially going into this busy part of the dance season. Hopefully everybody will be aware of these new first aid principles and be able to help dancers if any of them do, unfortunately, get an injury. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.